So many of you probably don't know what an architecture course looks like. And it's based around full year studio project, and during this time, we tend to learn about buildings. And most of you would expect us to learn how to design a building, and you'd be right, but only to some extent. So during our final years as architecture students, we tend to learn more about why you should be designing a building than how and with what materials. So just to outline a quick structure, we first identify an issue, then we come up with a brief. So a brief tends to be, it means instructions, basically. And then, based on those instructions, we design a building and hopefully solve the issue that we found at the beginning. Perhaps it's best to show you what I mean by telling you a story. And every good story has a context. And the context for our world today is that every ocean and every continent, from the tropics to the once pristine polar regions, is contaminated. It's also a story about drugs. It's a story about surfing. It's a story about clouds, magic, and water treatment. And it's a story about how all these come together. But I think most importantly, it's a story about being curious and finding a kind of lateral approach to problem solving. So when we started this project, we had only one constraint. The constraint was this had to be located in Govan, which is it's a struggling area of Glasgow. Now, within Govan, there's one major issue that I decided to focus on, and that's drug abuse. So it's Govan and drugs. When I researched drug abuse, there was this study done in the 80s, which set out to prove that heroin is it's an addictive substance. And the way they tried to prove it is they put rats in a cage, and they gave them two choices. They gave them a choice of water and heroin. And as you'd expect, the rats chose heroin over the water and eventually overdosed. But there was a man called Bruce Alexander who noticed that there's something seriously flawed with this experiment. And he noted that any of us put in a cage would likely choose the drugs because it would make the cage more interesting. So he instead proposed an alternative experiment, and he called it Rat Park. And basically the rats had everything to do. There was balls, there was tunnels, there were other rats. And funny enough, when they did the experiment and saw, they checked whether the rats would choose the heroin over the water, and they didn't. Only a few of the rats took the heroin, and none of them overdosed. So we can think of Govan as this kind of cage with things like deeply rooted deprivation, isolation, lack of perspectives, no sense of pride, and it's all set in this kind of industrial wasteland. And statistics have shown that that tends to amplify our worst traits. So things like drug abuse, gambling, alcohol, and being addicted to these virtual worlds. So what if there was something else in Govan? What if there was something to make us choose water over heroin? And this is kind of where my project began. So there is something else in Govan, and there's this massive post-industrial site. It used to be graving docks. And for 30 years, they've been struggling to find a new use for them. And now, very recently, corporate developers, are trying to, they've put in a planning application to turn it into high-end residential flats and hotels. And this is ultimately for shareholder profit. So when I visited the site, I thought, man, this looks like a playground. It's like, and perhaps it's me growing up by a lake. I always associated water with a kind of fun sense. So when I visited the site, though, it was contaminated. So I thought, well, okay, if I can make this into a playground, I first need to clean it, and hence the water treatment facility. So how do you treat water? There's 5 key steps in treating water. And the first one is you add coagulants to a tank, and these are harmless iron particles that basically stick to the pollutants and make them sink to the bottom. Then in the next tank, the sediment is removed, and then the water is filtered in another tank. It's aerated in the next tank, and then in the final tank, it's disinfected. Tank, tank, tank. It's very boring. Anyway, so I looked at it and I thought, okay, let's have a different approach to this problem. What else mixes water? And I thought, okay, well there must be something that mixes water. And I thought, hold on, waves mix water. In fact, they're really, really good at mixing mixing water. So I thought, well, why don't you, instead of mixing this water in a tank, why don't you mix it with a wave? Why don't you build something there that gives you this participatory experience? What if you give something to the people of Govan that also treats the water? So it's basically, you guys are probably thinking that the carbon footprint of that is insane. Well, not if you consider driving to the beach and going surfing then. So it's actually good for the environment, and if you mix the coagulants with that wave, you can treat the water. So that's the first step. So the project became then about, remember the 5 steps, about transforming each of those 5 steps into a kind of experience, into making kind of incorporating it into the landscape, so that it becomes this human park. And basically, to extend the analogy of Rat Park, so to outline some of the steps, and first you've got the wave pool, then you've got a temperate mangrove that filters the water, then you've got a beach, and I like to call it the sandcastle beach because you could actually build sandcastles on it. And there's different layers of, there's different courses of sand, and they basically filter the water. And then it's my building. And it's basically a cloud container. And many of you are thinking, well, hold on, why would you want to contain a cloud? And how do you do it? And what's the point? Well, funny enough, to treat water, you need to vaporize it. And this, if you make a cloud, the fine metal particles from our car exhausts, our chimneys, our industrial waste, they get separated from the water. So coincidentally, it also makes for a really nice architectural space. So this cloud fills out this building. And so once you have a cloud, and you need that water to then be purified, you need to bring it back down somehow. So again, I looked at the natural process and how do you condense the cloud? It's through a cooling effect. So the cloud would fill out this space, and then it would condense on the concrete sphere, you can see, and then it would drip down into the final tank for disinfection. So at this point, the magic comes in. I spoke about magic earlier. And a quote became very relevant to me, that any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. So this is the magic. So basically, you can freeze water in time. You can make it go upwards or downwards. And this is the technology behind it. I won't bore you with the technology, because this is what the final space would look like. It's a space where you can appreciate the droplets. They're frozen in time. And they serve as a reminder. They serve as a reminder that every droplet counts. And it's also, you can take that metaphor as far as you want. But I set out to design a water treatment facility, but I did much more than that. I made a civic space, a public building, and hopefully I designed a distraction from drugs, a distraction to help us choose water over heroin. And to end on a more on a lighter note, for my current studio project, I'm designing a death ray, and I hope to show you that one day. Thank you.